So we're staying in our annotation.dwg file, and you can see I've left it in the same state as it was at the end of the last video, where we've got the single line text saying bolting plate and plan, and the multi-line text is our notes column to the right of the bolting plate. Now, obviously what we're going to need to do as well is make sure that we add dimensions to our drawing. Otherwise, nobody's going to know how big the bolting plate actually needs to be. So in the same way that we did with text styles, we need to set up a dimension style. Now, my preference is to stay in the Home tab on the ribbon and go to the annotation flyout here and select dimension style there, like so. Now, you can do it that way if you want to, or you can go to the Annotate tab on the ribbon and click on the little arrow here like so, and that will also allow you to go to your dimension style there as well. So there's your dimension style manager there like so. I'm just going to close that, and I'm going to go back to the Home tab and highlight my little annotation flyout here and then click on dimension style there. Now, dimension styles are quite complex. Now, for this particular drawing, I'm going to be creating a metric dimension style. So it will be in millimeters, not inches, for those of you that might use imperial units, for example. Now, we've got ISO 25, we've got standard, we've got annotative. I'm going to use ISO 25 as my template, so make sure that that is the current dimension style. So there's ISO 25 there, click on set current, and you can see it's the current style at the top. Then when I select new, it'll actually say it's a copy of ISO 25. I'm just going to call it training, so that obviously we can distinguish it from the other dimension styles. I'm going to start with ISO 25, and I'm going to use it for all dimensions, and it's not going to be annotative. We'll cover that later. Now, the good thing is I can set up dimension families if I want to, sub-styles. So I can have a particular style that only applies to linear dimensions or diameters or perhaps radius, for example. I'm going to use it for all dimensions, and I'm going to click on continue. Now, as soon as I do that, it opens up this great big complex dialog box. Now, make sure that when you are placing your dimensions, all of your settings are set to by layer. Then it adopts the properties of the layer that you are using for your dimensions. Now, if you just look past the dimension style dialog box, you can see that I've left the current layer on text. Don't worry about that. It's not a problem. As long as you make sure that you place your dimensions on the dimensions layer in the drawing later when we place the dimensions, you'll be fine. Now we're going to work across the dialog box. We've got lines, symbols and arrows, text, fit, primary units, alternate units, and tolerances. We'll cover each of these tabs as we go, but just bear in mind everything will be in metric millimeters. So, lines tab first. The dimension lines are the lines that go between the arrowheads. You can see that in the preview there. So I'm going to set everything to by layer, because then it adopts the properties of the layer that you're placing the dimensions on. So everything goes to by layer. Baseline spacing, I'm going to set that to 10 millimeters. Extension lines are these vertical lines here that basically form the reference lines, so to speak, of the dimension. So again, all set to by layer. And again, you're going to work through all of these settings. And the good thing is once you've created one dimension style, you can copy them and obviously create other dimension styles from them. Extend beyond dimension lines, I'm going to set that to 2.5 millimeters. And the offset from origin is that little gap there that you can see coming off the extension lines. I'm going to set that to 4 millimeters. So as I keep hitting tab when I change a setting, can you see the preview is updating each time? So that's our lines all set up. Let's go to symbols and arrows. And you can see there that we're using close-filled arrowheads for our dimensions. Now, I could use architectural ticks, for example. And you can see that gives me that little slanted tick thing going on. Now, bearing in mind that this is a mechanical kind of drawing, you'd probably use close-filled arrowheads, not architectural ticks. Now, leaders, if you're using the QLeader command, I might change that to something like, let's say, an open dot or perhaps a box or something like that. So I'm going to change that to open dot, and the arrow size, I'm going to update that to 3.5 millimeters. And again, if I press tab, can you see the arrowheads change in the preview? Center marks apply to things like circles and arcs, where you can have a mark. If I press tab, and you can see there 2.5, The mark should appear in the center. Now the preview's obviously not got that much magnification on it, so you can't really see it, but you can also go and set it to lines as well if you want to. Personally, I leave that set to none because those marks and lines just create more objects that you'll probably have to delete at some point when you move the circle or change the circle or whatever. So I set that to none because the dimension will still pick up on the circle or the arc anyway. When you're breaking dimensions using the dim break command, the break size is 3.75 millimeters. I'm not going to change that. You can also create an arc length dimension with a little arc length symbol, so that can be preceding the dimension text or above it. I tend to use preceding, or you can set it to none. If you're creating jogged radii, for example, the angle is 45 degrees by default, and the jog height factor for linear jog on linear dimensions is 1.5 times the text height. I'm going to leave those as they are. I'm now going to go to the text tab. Now, the text style at the moment is using standard. I don't want to use that. I'm going to set it to training, like so, and that gives us that nice Verdana italic that we set up previously. Again, though, by layer. You can have a fill color behind the text, so let's say yellow, for example. I don't tend to use that unless I'm highlighting dimensions, so I'm going to set that back to none. And the text height, 2.5, is quite reasonable already. I can draw a frame around my text if I want to. You'll notice as well, I'll untick that and leave it switched off. Text placement vertically is above the dimension line, horizontally centered on the dimension line, and the view direction is left to right. If I change that right to left, I can change that, and can you see it goes upside down for different types of elevations and drawing styles? I'm going to leave that back to left to right. And the offset from the dim line, I'm going to go for 1.5 millimeters. When I tab that now, can you see it changes quite dramatically in the preview? Text alignment, you can have everything horizontal if you wish, or you can have it aligned with the dimension line, or you can have the ISO standard, which is a metric standard where anything that is radius or diameter related has a cranked dimension line, as you can see there with that radius. Let's go to the fit tab now. Now, fit options, I don't tend to change these, so all of these I leave as default settings. Now, we're going to use an overall scale of 1 in this case, and can you see that I'm not making it annotative either at the moment. I'm leaving it as it is. I'm not going to make it annotative at all. And then I'm going to place the text manually when I'm fine-tuning, and I'm going to draw a dim line between the extension lines. Now, when I tick that place text manually, that means every time I place a dimension, I've got to manually place the dimension text. Do I want that? Probably not really. Let's let AutoCAD do that automatically. Primary units, I can override any unit settings I may have with my dimensions, because at the moment you can see that my units, I've got things after the decimal place. So the unit format will be decimal. Precision, I'm not going to have any decimal places. And you can see there, decimal separator is a comma. Now, we'd normally use what is known as a decimal place. It's called a period in AutoCAD. So if I went to something like 1 decimal place, can you see it's adding a dot now instead of a comma? And I can switch on zero suppression. So if I switch that off and on, you'll see there anything that might have a 0, I can switch the trailing 0 off by ticking it. It's the same with the decimal degrees. If I set the precision there to 2 decimal places, can you see I've got 60 degrees in the preview? If I switch the trailing suppression on, it loses those zeros on the 60 degrees like so. And alternate units, if I want to display any alternate units, I might set it to architectural. Can you see there? I've got 14.1 millimeters and ½ an inch, for example. Now, normally you don't tend to display alternate units unless you're using multiple unit settings. So you might do that if you're working on an international project where you're working in the UK and the US where you need metric and imperial. I'm going to switch that off just purely for clarity. And then tolerances, if you're working, say, in metalworking or product design, you might need a method where you've got a deviation of plus or minus 10 millimeters. So if I set that to a deviation, can you see I've got the plus and minuses appearing on the dimensions? I'm going to set the tolerance to none as well, purely for clarity, and click on OK. So that's my dimension style all set up nice and neat and ready to go. So make sure you select it, set it as the current style, and then click on Close. And that is now your current dimension style for your AutoCAD drawing.